So are men and women truly equal in the eyes of the church? It's funny, the Bible can seem to give two totally conflicting answers. In this explainer, we are diving straight into one of the most heated debates in Christianity today, really getting into that tension between radical spiritual equality on one side and biblically defined authority on the other. Here's our roadmap. We'll start with what looks like a flat-out contradiction in the text. Then we'll look at the theological framework used to solve it. After that, we're going to zoom way in on one single, super controversial verse, tackle a major critique of that view, and finally, see why this ancient debate is hitting harder now than ever before. Let's jump in. All right, first up, an apparent contradiction. This whole thing really kicks off with the Apostle Paul, who seems to say two completely different things in his letters. And that set up a tension that's been echoing for, about 2,000 years. Okay, so check this out. On one side, you've got this absolutely revolutionary statement in Galatians. Our standing with God just wipes away all those worldly distinctions. Race, class, gender, gone. But then, on the other side, you've got this letter to Timothy, where Paul lays down a very clear restriction on what women can do in the church. So, which is it? Radical equality or clear restriction? For anyone who sees the Bible as a coherent whole, this isn't just a puzzle, it's a real problem that needs a solution.
So how do people try to square this circle? Well, that brings us to the main way this has been handled in many conservative traditions, a framework called complementarianism. Let's break down what that actually means.
The big word for this framework is complementarianism. And the core idea is pretty simple, really, that men and women are created 100% equal in value, in worth, and dignity, but they're also designed by God to have different or complementary roles, especially when it comes to the family and church leadership. And this right here is such a brilliant insight into the whole conversation. The debate isn't actually about whether men and women complement each other. I mean, pretty much everyone agrees they do. As you can see from the subtitle of this book, which comes from the opposing viewpoint, the real flashpoint, the whole argument, it all comes down to one word: hierarchy. Is there a divinely ordered structure of authority, or isn't there? That's the question. Now, proponents of this view spend a lot of time clarifying what it is not. They argue the real focus isn't on some kind of raw male authority, but on a husband's servant leadership that's supposed to look like Christ's. They'd say it doesn't forbid women from working, but it does make family a priority. And this is the big one. They are absolutely adamant that any kind of abuse is a sick twisting of the model, not a part of it. And now we get to it, the verse at the absolute epicenter of this theological earthquake. Seriously, how you interpret just a few Greek words in this one sentence has divided entire churches and denominations for centuries. So the verse reads, "I do not permit a woman to teach or to exercise authority over a man." And that little phrase right there, exercise authority, that translates a single and very, very rare Greek word. And yeah, that is the million-dollar question. Does Paul mean women can't hold any authority, period? Or is he saying they shouldn't abuse authority or maybe seize it in some improper way? The answer to that question changes literally everything about how this verse applies today. So the Greek word is authentanein, and here's the kicker. It only shows up once in the entire New Testament. Just this one time. Because it's so rare, it's always been really tough to pin down its exact meaning. But a ton of modern research into how this word was used in other ancient Greek writings has really started to clear things up. Okay, so for a long time, a lot of people argued that authentanein had this negative vibe, like to usurp authority or to domineer. And if that's true, Paul was just forbidding some kind of hostile takeover. But, and this is a huge but, a whole body of recent scholarship now says that in most ancient contexts, the word was actually neutral or even positive. It just meant to exercise authority. And that's a game changer, because it suggests Paul wasn't just forbidding a misuse of authority, but the very function of authority in this specific church setting. But holding that view leads to a really big problem. A charge of hypocrisy, really. And it's one that critics are super quick to bring up when they argue these rules aren't meant to be timeless. And the objection is a really good one. It basically goes like this. Complementarians say that since Paul bases his teaching on authority on the story of Adam and Eve from creation, it must be a universal rule for all time. The problem? Critics point out that Paul uses the exact same logic for another command that basically no church follows today. See? When you put them side by side, it's clear. Both the passage on church authority and this one about women wearing head coverings in church are both explicitly tied back to the Genesis creation story. So the question is powerful. If you're going to say the head covering rule was just for that culture, why isn't the authority rule also just for that culture? How can you pick and choose? So, how do they answer that? Well, the complementarian response is to draw a very sharp line between a timeless principle and its cultural application. They argue that, with head coverings, the creation argument is used indirectly to support a universal principle, gender distinction. The head covering itself was just the application of that principle in Corinth. But, they say, in the passage about authority, the creation argument is direct. The prohibition on exercising authority isn't just an application of a principle, it is the principle.
All right, for our last section, let's pull the camera way back. Because this whole thing, it's not just some dusty old internal church debate anymore. It's become a major flashpoint in a much, much bigger culture war over power, gender, and justice. And to really get a handle on the modern reaction, you have to understand a powerful framework sometimes called critical theory. To put it simply, it's a way of looking at the world that focuses almost entirely on power dynamics. It tends to see all of society as a web of relationships between oppressor groups and oppressed groups. And its goal is to expose how traditional structures keep those power imbalances in place. This table shows it so clearly. You're basically looking at two fundamentally different stories about the world. In the Christian story, our biggest problem is sin, a vertical rebellion against God. But in the story told through the lens of critical theory, our biggest problem is oppression, a horizontal conflict between people. And because they identify completely different problems, they propose radically different solutions.
And this explains exactly why a position like complementarianism can sound so jarring today. I mean, if your starting point is that any hierarchy is about unjust power, then a theological framework that argues for God-given authority structures, well, it's just going to sound like a religious excuse for oppression. And that leaves us with one last, really challenging question. When one worldview looks at a structure and sees a divine design meant for human flourishing, and another worldview looks at that exact same structure and sees a tool of oppression, is a meaningful conversation even possible anymore? It's a question that goes way beyond one Bible verse and gets right to the heart of the deep divides in our culture today. Thanks for joining us for this explainer.